wouldn't even dare say that majority of the GOP are Christians at all. Counterintuitive when I see believers voting for politicians who hate God and just want to silence the church. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, we can make all the laws we want, but if we don't share the gospel, then people's hearts aren't going to change, and ultimately they're not going to be saved and go to heaven. So
you have a successful platform, you have all these things. Some people might call you a girl boss. So welcome back, guys. I am super excited to have this next guest on. She's somebody whose content I've been learning a lot from for a long time now. She was kind enough to even help me out back in the day when censorship was kind of just getting started and getting on everybody's radar. She came out to DC to help me out with Censor You and Morgan Ariel. So I really wanted to make sure we had this conversation and really just talked about all the things that us as believers should be doing, especially in the realm of politics. She's somebody who has spent time in DC and has had experience in the political world and in different organizations. So without further ado, Noelle, thank you so much for being here.
thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Same here. Let's just start with a quick recap of like kind of where you're at now with your content. We don't have to really do the origin story thing. I think if people are watching this, odds are they've heard of you or they've seen some of your content. So where are you at now as far as content creation? What are you focusing on?
Right now I'm just writing a lot for a few different news orgs, but I've been working a lot with Concerned Women for America, and now I'm going to be working with independent women. And for me as a believer, I think my main priority with content is just to make sure that, I mean, as it is, the world is going to be a mess, regardless of how politics goes left and right. But I think as believers in America, as the church, we should be really clear on where we stand on a lot of those political issues. So when it comes to whether I'm writing or whether it's my content, I try to make sure that that's the focus ultimately, and that mainly I'm talking to the believers. There's a lot of people who aren't believers who follow me, and I'm excited and hope that they can hear the gospel through one of the posts. But that's my main focus, is talking to specifically young Gen Z girls from a biblical worldview about politics. So
I love that. I think you bring up a really great point, which is the world's always going to be messed up regardless of how much we dive into politics. And I think that's one of the reasons. So I'm kind of in the more charismatic side, of evangelical side of churches. I think you're more reformed in your theology, but either way, and we probably can both agree that the woke kind of culture has creeped into the church a little bit, and I think for a lot of believers, it's just like, where is that line about caring about politics versus spreading the gospel? I had I think it was like a 2-hour stream with like Honest Youth Pastor and Virgil Walker and Bible Dingers about this subject. Like, can Christians vote Democrat? Like, where's the line with all this stuff? How should Christians engage with politics?
yeah, I think that, over the past 2 years that I started getting involved in politics, I think my views have definitely changed over time. But I think that, as believers, it's really important that we don't make an idol out of politics. I know I've done that in the past where, it's interesting. It's the world around us, and it's super easy to just get caught up in everything that's going on. But just maintaining that balance of, okay, as a believer, yes, I'm supposed to be informed. I'm going to vote. The Lord calls me to care about people and to stand up against injustice. So I'm going to do these things, but also keeping in mind that ultimately God is sovereign. He appoints and removes leaders. And I think that's something that I've kind of had to learn over time of, okay, how do I balance and navigate this world as a believer? Because a believer is going to navigate the world of politics so much differently than someone who's secular.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. One of the things that I've come to the realization of, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, is politics being more of a missions field than it is an actual vehicle for evangelism, right? So we can go into the world of politics with the intention of preaching the gospel to the people that we encounter through that, and we can be passionate about, economics and, defending things against communism and stuff like that, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the ultimate goal, right? The ultimate goal should be to preach the gospel. So one of the things I've realized, and I'd love to get your thoughts on, is this idea that we have a responsibility to steward the things that God has given us, right? And one of those things that he's given us is putting us in a country where we get the privilege of participating in the political as average citizens, which is historically something very rare, and especially very rare for Christians. And so I'm interested in your thoughts on like the responsibility that's placed on us as people who God has placed here sovereignly in this year, in this time, and are able to participate in politics. Is there a responsibility to do that?
I think as believers, like you said, in the past, Christians haven't been able to kind of be involved in politics and in the public sphere. And I think two things come to mind is one, the way that we can ensure that we can keep worshiping freely and keep spreading the gospel. I mean, in Canada, you can't say that homosexuality is a sin.
Right.
Um, so the way, I mean, we want that space to be able to proclaim the gospel and to share it boldly, and believers voting in favor of politicians who will continue to protect that freedom. Ultimately, again, Romans 13 talks about God appointing and removing leaders and God being in control of the government ultimately.
Right.
But as a believer, of course, I think we should vote for politicians and support politicians who are going to protect our religious freedom and I mean, it seems counterintuitive when I see believers voting for politicians who hate God and just want to silence the church. It doesn't make any sense. Like, though we want, I mean, the gospel will be spread either way, but why are we going to make it so much more difficult by voting for evil politicians who hate Christ, And I think the other thing is, I think I wrote a post about this where, the secular person is involved in politics. Either way, sometimes people say, oh, well, you can't legislate morality or Christians shouldn't be in politics, but it's like, the secular person has their own religion. Whether they're
Yes.
atheist or agnostic, their set of morals is their philosophy. It's their religion. So they're going to vote for what they believe is correct according to their morals or their religion. So why shouldn't Christians be involved? Because someone's view is going to win, whether it's
Yeah.
going to be evilness or it's going to be, God's transcendent truth and objective truth. So as believers, of course, we should be involved in that sphere. And that doesn't mean a theocracy, but it definitely means that we advocate for what is good and what is true. And we let God take care of it. But, we're citizens here on earth as well. And we should, the Bible says, whatever you do, do it for the glory of God. That includes politics. So.
Yeah, that's a great response, and you're totally right. Secularists, they have a worldview, right, and their worldview informs what they vote for and how they vote, and even their involvement, whether they want to be in the public sector, whether they want to, be in public office. Like it that is one of the things that drives them, is their morality wants them to convey these things as good. And so us as Christians who have, in my opinion, the correct morality, a morality based on the biblical, it's our responsibility to make sure that our society is run by morals that are influenced by the Bible. So it's been definitely kind of like a big thing that I talk about a lot in my content, because in my opinion, a lot of Christians see politics as like something that doesn't have to do with the church or even with our spiritual lives. And to me, it's like, well, maybe at one point that might have been true, but in a day where the political has been very much made personal and we're surrounded by it now with social media, it's very hard to avoid political issues on the day to day. And therefore we kind of have to do our part in making sure we not only we teach people proper doctrine, catechize them correctly, but also that we teach them about the truth of what's happening in the world, aka why socialism never worked and is bad and is actually not biblical, etc. One of the things that I think would be awesome to get your take on is this thing that happened with Matt Gaetz and the 20 people in Congress who were kind of holding out on McCarthy to be Speaker of the House. That feels like to a lot of Christians a little bit in the weeds, but I got a lot of pushback for posting a picture with Matt Gaetz because he's not a Christian. He hasn't claimed to be a Christian. He's very much kind of like a populist more than he is a conservative. And to me, he cares more about making sure people are free to worship how they want than anybody on the left side of the aisle. And so I support him, not because of his personality or decisions he's made in his private life, but because of his public policies and the things that he wants to see for this country. And so I think there's a distinction to be made there. I'm wondering if you can talk about like the distinction of like voting for somebody for their policy versus voting for somebody because of like their personal lives and what they personally believe.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I actually had to learn the hard way. And,
Yeah.
I think it's important for us as believers to remember one, we're not voting for a pastor. We are voting for, we're voting for just a political leader, which of course, ideally, it'd be great if they loved Jesus and followed solid theology, but it's probably very unlikely that that'll happen, although there are a few great ones. But, we are electing a public official, not a pastor. And also, I think it's important that we remember that, for example, this might get me in trouble on the conservative side, but I think Donald Trump is a great example of that, of distinguishing between a political leader and, and why we vote for someone like Trump. I mean, I look at Trump's life and I can't say whether or not he's a Christian, but I can look at the fruit of his life and say that, okay, this is not fitting the definition of what a Christian is. And so it's like, I think a lot of Christians kind of felt conflicted of, do I vote for this politician when their life is full of this sin? Or do I just not vote at all? Or do I vote for the other side? But it's like, okay, well, I'm going to vote for the candidate that is going to protect my right to worship Christ and to share the gospel. And I don't see any candidates on the left doing that.
Right.
Like earlier I mentioned, they hate God. They want God out of schools. They want our churches silenced. They closed our churches. I'm not going to vote for a side that is going to try to suppress the gospel as much as possible. And I mean, ultimately, God's more powerful than they are, but I'm not going to encourage that or support that, and the right has a lot of flaws. I wouldn't even dare say that majority of the GOP are Christians at all. But
Right.
what I would say is majority of them protect religious liberty and protect, that libertarian, I guess, concept of freedom. And that I'm thankful for, and I think that that's God's common grace in allowing us to have that freedom as Americans to vote for politicians who are going to protect our freedom. So again, we're not voting for a pastor, but we're going to vote for the person that encourages us, or maybe not encourages, but protects our right to share the gospel.
Right. That allows us the fundamental freedom to worship God in the open, as opposed to cracking down on churches because they don't like the way we gather during specific seasons that we've had in the recent past, which I won't mention it here because we're on YouTube. But no, I totally understand. And there's a phrase that I want to bring up and I want to get your initial reaction to, because it's been a talking point that I've heard all over like modern Christianity, used in such a negative way. And maybe it is negative. I'll leave that up to you to describe it. The phrase is Christian nationalist.
Oh man, I hear this term get thrown around so much. And I have so many thoughts, but I
It's a
think
lot.
it is, because I can see both sides, I guess, to the term. And I have seen people, I guess I'll start with like the negative and then the positive. But
Okay.
when it comes to that term, I have seen some politicians claim to be Christian nationalists and then almost in a way push for like a theocracy, but then I hear them talk about Jesus and I'm like, okay, that's definitely not biblical. Like, just stick to politics. Don't touch theology. Please don't touch theology. And so I think that kind of concerns me when I see them using Jesus into their political rhetoric. Like, we see the left do that. We see the left use the gospel and the Bible and they twist it to advocate for social justice. And I've seen the right do that as well. Not as much, but I've seen them do it. And I think that when I hear that word, those circumstances pop into my head. But at the same time, I also think that word Christian nationalism that's used by the left a lot is almost a boogeyman word. Because we look at the TV shows, the movies, Hollywood. I mean, I'm from Los Angeles. We look at colleges, universities, and no one is really, they hate when you mention Jesus. They hate when you mention God. So it's like, who's really a Christian nationalist? It seems like everyone hates God and hates the gospel. The gospel is not attractive to the person who hates God. So I really don't understand where they get all of this fear about Christian nationalism. Just going to a secular university and living in LA, it's rare that you meet a believer. You're the oddball if you're a believer. And
Right.
now I'm living in the Bible Belt, so it's very different. But still, it's like, I feel like it's most of the time used as just a boogeyman word to scare people, to get them riled up, and just a fear tactic a lot of the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think when I first heard it, I was like, okay, well, I don't want to go too far to the right and saying like I do believe this is a Christian nation and I will, fight for Christianity to be here. But the more I dive into it, the more I realize that there's something that the left means by Christian nationalism that I don't think we understand on the right, and that's that they're mistaking the word nationalism for imperialism, right?
Mm,
Where we're trying to overcome or like take over other places in the name of Christ, and
mm.
therefore like establish our theocracy on them, right? And I think that's the boogeyman that you talked about that a lot of people are scared of. But what I've come to realize is if you just break down the phrase Christian nationalist, Christian meaning follower of Jesus, and nationalism meaning pride in your country, I think that there is a good argument to make that we should, as Christians, be nationalists. We should enjoy and seek the prosperity of the country that God has sovereignly placed us in. Now, this doesn't mean that we want to make everybody believe like we do. It just means that we want to protect the sovereign nation, and we want to make sure that this place is well taken care of and well stewarded, because it's like the parable of the sower of the seeds. Like we need to take what God has given us, and we need to make of it as much as we can so that we can flourish and leave things for the next generation. So that's kind of where I go with Christian nationalism. Like, the problem is imperialism. The problem is trying to go somewhere else and say, you now think like I think. But like, in my opinion, what Christian nationalism should be and should be defined from now on is a bottom up idea of the gospel, where we start by relaying the gospel to each other and to the people around us. And that eventually influences the fabric of the culture enough to really make the country more Christian, as opposed to getting somebody really powerful into the top echelon of the government and then instituting Christian laws, right? I think that's not the gospel. The gospel is bottom up. It's the upside down kingdom.
I do agree that the gospel is definitely bottom up. I think that one thing that I've kind of seen in the political sphere is even at conferences, we're so quick to talk about, I mean, kind of like throw God in our speeches. And it's more of like America and then, God supporting America.
Right.
And it's like, okay, well, I mean, laws are good. Moral laws are good. For example, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, great. But also, people's hearts need to change. I think that
Yeah.
sometimes we approach it backwards, and I think that creating certain laws that don't hurt people. Again, this kind of goes into a gray area, but I think that sometimes certain things can cause resentment in people's lives. And I think that as Christians, first and foremost, we should, again, advocate for just laws, but share the gospel, because people's hearts, when they change, that's going to create change in a society. I mean, we can make all the laws we want, but if we don't share the gospel, then people's hearts aren't going to change, and ultimately they're
Yeah.
not going to be saved and go to heaven. So,
Yeah, I didn't say this. I forget who said it, but don't give me credit for it. But you can't legislate a changed heart, and
mm,
I think that's the crucial part of this. The people that are seeking to kind of do this Christian imperialist thing, where they want to take over the government in the name of Jesus and legislate a new Christian nation, they're missing the point of the gospel, which is that salvation is individual, for one, that we have to deny ourselves to follow Christ is the next, and then ultimately that we choose. We have to be the one that changes our hearts. Us being ambassadors of Christ is not using our power to exercise against other people, but it's actually using our meekness and our humility to influence other people and change their hearts in ways that only God can. So I think that the conversation around Christian nationalism should look more like, what's the most effective way to evangelize or spread the gospel without causing bitterness in other people. And I think a great example you brought up, which was Roe v. Wade, the celebration of it on the church, I think was great. And then there were certain people that I was listening to that were talking about the nuance of like now not bringing shame to maybe women who have had abortions and repented of it and are now Christians or in that process somewhere. So there has to be room for that, because as the church, like James says, true religion is to take care of the widows and the orphans. And a lot of times, women who are in those situations are doing it because they don't have husbands or they don't have a support group like that. And I think understanding that and being kind of the helping hand, being the hands of Jesus in that situation will require us, yes, to celebrate the overturning, but also to have compassion on the people that may have done that and either are repenting or want to repent and are somewhere in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just thought back to yesterday's sermon at church, and we were going over Mark 7, I believe, and just talking about how, sin is bad, but sin is a repercussion of our soul, of our hearts, of our unrepentant heart, of our unregenerate heart. And so the actions that we do, whether it's abortion, whether all of these sins that are political as well, those aren't the things that, I mean, yes, we repent of those things and that's an evidence of our salvation, but ultimately it's our hearts, it's who our sinful nature. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that, that we're sharing the gospel with someone who is dead in their sins. It's not so much because of the thing. I mean, the Bible says, be holy for I'm holy, not be conservative for I'm conservative or whatever,
Yeah.
so, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Since we're in this area of abortion and stuff, I know that you talk a lot about women in this space, right? Women in Christianity, women in politics. You know, you've spent some time in D.C. I don't know if you're going back or not, but what's been your experience like as a woman? What do you see the role of let's say a female Christian being in DC? What is that? Does that look different? What's your experience with feminism in that area? Like, talk to me about this.
Oh man, that's a really loaded question.
Mm.
But I think again, even with this topic, my views have changed over time. Just like a quick little side note, I used to be like the super, I don't know, maybe kind of feminist. Like I'm gonna get all these degrees, I'm gonna get a doctorate, and I'm not gonna change my last name even if I get
So
married.
what I was gonna actually say, and I thought about this before, but not to cut you off, but yeah, you've gone to college, you have these accomplishments, you have a successful platform, you have all these things. Some people might call you a girl boss. That's what I'm saying. So what is your response to that?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that I've kind of had to wrestle with because like ultimately, I mean, the Lord definitely changed my heart from like wanting zero kids and not changing my last name and all of that stuff to desiring those things. And I think that, for example, I was watching a video earlier talking about that singleness is a gift from the Lord, and I'm personally, even though I've gotten these degrees and working on another one right now, um, I know that the season, ultimately God is sovereign, and the season that he has me in right now is how I can glorify him. And I think that for women, sometimes we kind of like go back and forth because there's like this big trad movement, of like
Hmm.
women not being leaders, whether it be in the political sphere or going to work and then being home. I think that's beautiful. I think that if you have children, your ministry is at home, you're just, your main role is at home. But I think also at the same time, there's women like myself who are not married, and it doesn't like, this is, God has us on a different path, and I think that that's okay as long as we remember that our purpose in this life is to glorify Christ and make him known. And whether that's in politics, whether that's discipling our children, we can glorify God in both avenues. But also to remember that like whatever we're doing isn't about us. Like
Yeah.
going to DC is so like it's a very niche group of people that make it to DC, and I'm very thankful that God opened the doors for me to be able to go there. And I think just reminding myself of why am I here? Like ultimately I'm here to glorify Christ and to serve my boss well and to advocate for policies that I believe are going to help people and that are going to bring God glory. And I think just remembering that, one great organization that kind of helped me navigate that was Concerned Women for America / Young Women for America.
Hmm.
They always keep the gospel first. They're the nation's largest women's public policy group, and they're Christian and they're female. And I think that they're such a beautiful example of how women can navigate that space. And again, everyone's journey is going to look different. I mean, if it looks like you are going to not pursue like a career and you're going to be at home, that's beautiful. Don't be bitter. And I think that again, for women who are single, who
Hmm.
God's opened the door for a career, don't be bitter. It's so easy to kind of look at the other side and say the grass is greener there, the grass is greener there. I'd have this, and that. But that's ultimately not what God has chosen for your life, at least not in this time. And be content and glorify him wherever he has you, if that makes sense. But
Yeah, I think there is the need for an understanding of the sovereignty of God, right? Like whatever place that you're in your life, God has purposed it for some reason, and whether that means you're single, whether that means you're married, whether that means you're engaged, whatever the case, God has a plan for that, and a way for you to serve him through that time. I do think when you brought up the trad movement's interesting because I think in a lot of ways it's a response or like an overreaction to the feminist movement. And I think that what's happening is that a lot of people are getting the trad part, but they're not getting the God part, right? And so you have a lot of men who want to be trad and therefore want to buy guns and buy a farm and have a wife and have 12 kids, but they don't want to submit to God, right? And I think that is a big problem because the institution of marriage functions the most properly under the presupposition that you both believe in God and that you both serve Jesus. And I think apart from that, there's a lot of room for things to go wrong if you don't have that center. Hey, there's room for things to go wrong even if you do have that at the center. So let alone if you don't.
Yeah.
So I think the trad movement is really interesting in that. But what I have seen is a lot of girls have gone into the trad movement looking for that godly man, and there hasn't been as many godly men, but more so like ultra Republican successful men, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that there is those men. They exist. I will say that. But I think that one of the things that I like to do with my content is push for that within men, and including myself, which is why I look to stronger men, people that do influence me and that can teach in order to become that. But we're all in process. But I do think that there is a necessary change that has to happen in the hearts of both of those people. If they're going to do the trad thing, it has to be with God at the center.
Absolutely. I think that's a big like thing that a negative repercussion that I've seen from the trad movement. You know, it's like, sure, all these homesteading's great. I want to have a farm one day, but
Yeah.
if you don't have a relationship with Christ, your life is going to fall apart from Christ is death. Like you are
Yeah.
not, even if you have a farm, your marriage, I mean, I've seen so many marriages fall apart without Christ, and that's not to say that I mean, there's plenty of secular successful marriages, but just remembering, like you said, that Christ needs to be at the center of everything, you know, and I think that's when we get toxicity. We get people like Andrew Tate. We get people
Yes.
like who are just these completely, they care, like you said, about just owning guns and all and drinking raw milk, which is fine. I like guns and raw milk too.
Hmm.
But ultimately, like me being from a boss babe who wanted to get a doctorate and all this stuff, which is fine. Those are good things. But like my heart was not changed by the trad movement. My heart
Hmm.
was not changed by seeing, and I love Little House on the Prairie dresses, but like my heart wasn't changed by like soft voices and flowers and you know, pretty dresses. My heart was changed by the gospel, and God changed my heart to want to desire a husband, want to disciple kids. Those desires came when Christ changed my heart. And I think that's something we need to remember is that, you know, these things are great, but apart from Christ, they're meaningless. Everything is meaningless apart from Christ.
Absolutely. I mean, I love that you brought up Andrew Tate because I think that's what a lot of men are dealing with. I have a lot of friends that are fully on the Tate train. And to me, what I see is lacking is the humility, is the ability to submit to God, to be able to die to your own flesh. And I think it takes a man of God to be able to say, I'm going to suppress my own selfish desires. I'm going to kill my own selfish desires in exchange for the good of someone else. And a lot of the times, not necessarily the trad movement, but more so like the red pill stuff is an excuse to just further those selfish desires and say, okay, there's this problem going on with feminism and fourth wave feminism, and the culture is totally degenerate. So then I'm going to exploit the culture instead of trying to, help restore in some way. Like the heart of the gospel is always restoration, and I think that has kind of gone unseen or untalked about because let's say the forefront of the people that are talking about this stuff, Tate, even Jordan Peterson, they're not Christians. And because of that, they're lacking something fundamental to masculinity, which is the need to subject to an ultimate authority and the need to be able to deny yourself. And I think if we can bring that into the conversation of masculinity, we can really make a change in men's lives.
Yeah, and one thing I just want to mention is like men. God says to love your wives as Christ loved the church.
Yeah.
That is what masculinity is. Christ died for the church. It
It's
is servanthood.
self-sacrifice.
It is self-sacrificing. And we see people like Andrew Tate and these red pill guys. You know, I see that they're living with their girlfriends. You know, they're having sex outside of marriage. A servant, someone who's protecting and leading their wife or their girlfriend, protecting their purity, they're not going to do those things. I mean, if you want to be truly masculine, love your wife, love the person you're dating as Christ loved the church, and that's going to be a lot harder than you think it is. A lot harder than drinking raw milk and owning guns. So.
It's so true. It's one of the hardest conversations to have in like within the church, because men are already having, in my opinion, especially in my area with the charismatic circles, things are very emotionally driven, and so you do see a lot of, it's really hard to address issues of masculinity within that context. So I've kind of become a person within my own congregation of just to put it lightly, humorously, the most based, so people like go to me like, what do you really think about this whole feminism? There are guys will come up to me like, what do you really think about, Andrew Tate and all this? And I have to break it to him like, Andrew Tate is godless. He's a degenerate. And if you want to be like him, you're straying from the purpose that God has for you. But if you want to pursue the gospel and you really want true masculinity, you go for self-sacrifice. You go to, giving your life for your family. Like that's where you go to. And I do think that there's elements. I think Andrew Tate's a net negative. I do think Jordan Peterson's a net positive in the sense that he is pushing restoration. He's pushing healthy boundaries, healthy relationships. But his worldview is kind of sustained in midair because of his lack of declaring the gospel to be true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think people can definitely say good things, but like I don't know, I think of it like a water. When you put something in it, like whether it be dye, and there's a little
Yeah.
bit of, untruth or bad, whether it be theology, it just kind of contaminates the whole thing, So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's hard. It's a hard conversation.
It's very true. Very true. I want to do a hard shift of subject here. Something else that we have in common is we're both Hispanic, right? I think that's something that we've probably messaged about at one point. The way Latinos in America as like a meta narrative are being treated by both by the woke and also the far right. There's this weird thing happening where we're almost left out of the discussion. It's like either black or it's white, and we're one of the largest people groups in this country. So it's really interesting that we're not brought into this narrative either by the woke, which all they want to do is change Latino to Latinx. That's really all they care about. And then on the right, it's kind of like, well, this is a white country and, the browning of America is ultimately bad for the country. And me, I'm like in between thinking to myself, well, no, the country is based on an ideology, and if we share that ideology, why in the world does skin color matter? And so, what are your thoughts on that? That's kind of been happening. What are you seeing with that? And we could talk about the border a little bit after this. I'm not a specialist, but I think it would be cool to get your take on these things.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that the conversation is often like black or white and pretty polarized. Even when I went to DC, Latinos, even though we're the second largest voting, population, there was way more of every single group than there was Latinos on the Hill.
Yeah.
And that was a little bit discouraging. I mean, the people that I saw that looked like me were the people cleaning, and the people serving food um, and that was it was sad, and I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. I mean, I think resources is one. I think people just need to search them out, and a lot of other things, but
There's
I do.
also another reason, not to cut you off, but the age is skewed. So Latinos overall are younger in their literally in their age than any other people group. So because of
Even for
that,
the interns though.
even for the interns.
Yeah, even for the interns, it was pretty reflective of
Oh
like
wow.
the demographics of the members. So, which was
Yeah.
surprising.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's what I was going to say. That's one of the reasons that we aren't as represented in a lot of things, because a lot of us, a lot of the Latino population are not old enough to be in places of power, as the left would say, and in places of influence.
Yeah, and I think one thing that like I wrestle with sometimes as a believer is, for example, Maxwell Frost just ran. He's black, but he's a young Gen Z or first Gen Z elected
Mm,
to Congress, and a lot of people, even on the right, I saw were excited. A lot of Gen Zers are like, "Oh my gosh, Gen Z's in Congress." But for me, I'm like, I don't care if he comes from a similar background as me because his beliefs are so opposite to the gospel,
right.
and even though I love when I saw Myra Flores and I love when I see people who are wearing the hoops on the floor and they're advocating for like awesome legislation. I love that. But I love more a politician who is going to vote for things that align with my biblical values. And thank God
Yeah.
Myra was one of them. It was a
Yeah.
plus plus with her.
That's
Um,
what was great about Myra is like, yeah, she's a Latino woman. She's actually like Hispanic and et cetera, but even more so, she's a believer, right? She's advocating for things that are, actually objectively good values. And that what was really rewarding about her. To me, I always get that push pull in my head too of like, man, I want more quote unquote Latino representation because just statistically there should be more. But then at the same time, I really don't care if they're Latino, if they're just not, they're not purveying the same thing that I think is of like good values for the country. So yeah, I have that push and pull all the time.
Yeah, and I think that like I kind of see like the extreme jump from some other people where they're like, "Oh, ethnicity doesn't matter. Like I'm just colorblind." And I kind of had that mindset for like a split second. I'm like,
Yeah,
"No, like God created me fearfully and wonderfully made exactly how I am. Like it wasn't he didn't accidentally make me Latina. Like he didn't
yeah,
accidentally like it was intentional, And I think that one of the stories that was very encouraging to me was Esther, like she was of Jewish heritage and God used her to save the Jewish people. And that wasn't her identity. Her primary identity was a follower of God, but God
yeah.
used her identity to save the Jewish people. And I think that's a way for us who are minorities in that political space of, God created us fearfully and wonderfully made. I love being Hispanic. At the same time, my primary identity is in Christ, and I believe that God can use my ethnic identity as well for His glory. And I think that that's why He does everything intentionally.
I love that. I think that's so true. Like, it, at one point, I was feeling like I'm American. There's nothing about my culture that I should be bringing into this. But then it's like I actually enjoy my culture. I'm proud of like my heritage. I won't say culture, but my heritage, and I think it's there's aspects of it that are good. But once again, I think what is more of a priority is the gospel and what priorities the kingdom teaches, which sometimes do coincide are opposite of my heritage, right? Like my in Peru specific, there's a lot of Santeria. There's like a Señor de los Milagros, which is like kind of a worship of this painting in Peru that was made by a black slave I think in the 40s or something like that. And it's the biggest celebration in all Peru. So there's a lot of those things that I'm like, those things are antithetical to the gospel, plain and simple. So I can't stand. But man, I love ceviche. I love the
Same.
food.
No, I'm like blasting Bad Bunny. Probably should not have said that. I occasionally listen to Bad Bunny, but like I'm like blasting music in
Let's
my
be
car.
real. If you're Latino, you definitely have or do listen to Bad Bunny occasionally, and then repent for it,
Yeah, I'm
because
just like,
he's wild.
I don't understand. That's my excuse. I know that's something the Lord needs to work out in me, but yeah, I'm just like, yeah, I'm a Nosabo kid. I only understand the general topic, so I'm just gonna. But yeah,
Yeah, I love it, and yeah, it's really cool to see Hispanic artists breaking through into American mainstream and stuff like that. I just wish it was Faruco instead of Bad Bunny because he became a Christian, but that's just preference.
yeah.
All right, let's go into the border a little bit and what's going on there. I you know where I work. I won't say it publicly, but working where I work, I've seen a lot of things in regards to the border. And what I have seen and what's come to my attention is that the full story is never really getting told on Fox News, anywhere. It's not really getting told. What's really happening is that you have these cartels that are pretty much doing a marketing pitch to all of these surrounding countries like Colombia, Venezuela, all these places, convincing people that America has the dream for you. And much like a scam, these cartels are saying, all right, well, it's going to be X amount of dollars to get you there. We're going to get you there. It's going to be all inclusive, right? And these people fall victim to the scam and then essentially get trafficked all the way into America and endless kind of bad things happen to them. So a lot of these illegal immigrants that are coming over the border were coerced to come over the border, kind of not by their own volition, but more so because they got scammed into it. And then on top of that, they're getting raped and they're getting all these things that are happening bad to them on their way in, and getting robbed at the same time because they're getting held ransom for more money from either immigrant family members that are already in the country illegally or what have you. So there's all these misconceptions about the immigrant people, right? Like, they just shouldn't come over the border. I hear a lot of that coming from the right, is like, well, they just shouldn't come over illegally. They shouldn't. And it's missing the great nuance of, like, these people, in a lot of ways, a lot of them are victims. There are ones that are not, but in a lot of ways they are. What's your view on what's going on there, and what have you learned, and how has your opinion changed?
Yeah, I think you're right that there is a lot of nuance in this conversation, a lot of empathy to be had. I think I definitely kind of went from like, you know, I had like a very hard line view on it, and I still do. I do believe that you should enter legally, but I
Of
also
course.
believe that, we need to speed up the process. We need to fix a lot of things. There's things we can do to help people come over, and I think that also my view is kind of changed a little bit by an experience I had in DC. We were required to go to lunches where they invited speakers, and one of the speakers that came, white dude, and I promise it's relevant to the story, but he runs this pretty big organization and they're anti-immigration, like entirely anti, just no one should come.
Mm.
And he was saying, he compared specifically Mexican immigrants to people with mental disabilities. He said the word wetback, not like as a first person attack, but like in a story. He said a lot of things that I just was not. I never really heard someone speak so, I guess, say such degrading things about Hispanics. And I remember asking him questions after, but that was kind of hard for me to process, to remind myself that, like, wow, these people actually exist.
And
And
would we know his name if you said? You don't have to say it, but would we know his name if you said it, or is he kind of like in the
he's
weeds
not
a little bit?
super well known. Like, we don't have to worry. It's not like Matt Gaetz or anyone. Like, it's not a member of Congress at all.
Right. Okay.
I think that this is very a fringe minority. I think it's a fringe minority on the right, but I have seen predominantly Caucasians kind of use that same rhetoric. And again, fringe minority, very small fringe minority. Not
Yeah.
most Caucasians are not like that. Um, but just to see that this exists, I think kind of made me a little bit more compassionate and like sensitive to the situation.
Yeah.
And again, legal immigration, we can definitely reform the process. But I mean, America, what makes us so beautiful is we have people from all walks of life,
Yeah.
from every different country. I think it would be so antithetical to what America is to just shut down the border. But at the same
100%.
time, like Mexico, El Salvador, like all of these countries need to fix their own countries and stop, pushing people out. Like it's not fair that I see people getting certain government benefits or benefits for college when they came in illegally. And again, a lot of nuance, but countries need to be able to take care of their own people. And
Yes.
so that is super important too. I think these countries need to own up and take more responsibility too.
Yeah, I think that's where the conversation of nationalism comes back into the picture, right? Because I'm not just an American Christian nationalist, but I'm also, if I lived in Peru, I'd be a Peruvian Christian nationalist. Like, I think every person should be a nationalist for the country they live in. And I think that that's how you get to a place where you take pride in your country and want to fix it and want to stop people from leaving because they were born into this amazing culture that you want to essentially keep them in and keep a successful country. I do think it's a great point you bring up. A lot of these countries are kind of sending they're getting rid of the people that they don't want in the country, and like, we'll just send them to America and have America deal with it. And as people in the upper echelons of government, of course that's a benefit for them. They don't have to pay for the jailing, they don't have to pay for the policing, they don't have to pay for all of these things that those people are probably doing. And so yeah, there's so much nuance to the conversation, and definitely, like, I've had those experiences like you mentioned in DC, very much so in DC as well, where people were completely anti-immigration, but also like I'm not somebody that gets offended easily, like at
Right.
all. I mean, to be in the space, you can't really be offended easily, and so I've had really hard conversations. But what really gets me is like the jokes that people claim are jokes but really aren't jokes, and I've gotten a lot of those. The more I've gotten into political circles, the more I've gotten the whole like, oh yeah, this is, and they would straight up say like, I'll say it because I guess I can, according to the left, like just spick, right? Like in
Mm.
jokes and stuff, and they'll just say things, and I'm just like, you're not really kidding, bro. Like I can tell
Yeah,
you're not really kidding,
like
and I'm
that
not
passive
personally offended.
aggressive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but like I can tell, and it speaks a lot of your character, right? And so I definitely think there's a big conversation to be had there, and I think it would be great for people who are God fearing, Bible believing Christian Latinos to be in office and be in those conversations where legislation is actually getting passed. I think that would be awesome for our country.
Yeah, I think there needs to be way more people like Myra Flores
Yeah.
speaking on that issue because, it's one thing to be when you have direct ties to immigration. I mean, both of my grandparents from my mom's side immigrated. I think it kind of just changes your whole worldview on it. And we definitely need those Latino voices to speak truth into that area for sure.
Yeah, I mean, both of my parents are immigrants, so like I have, if there was no immigration, I wouldn't be here, and so I think that's that's wild, but
Yeah.
yeah, I love that. I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you have a little bit of a meeting. We're hitting 45 minutes. Let us know where we can find you. Let us know whatever it is that's current that you're doing, YouTube, Instagram, all these things, um, whatever you want to plug.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. This was super, super fun. I love being able to talk about politics and the Lord. So,
Yeah.
but Instagram is Noelle Fitch. I kind of like am working on something right now, so I had to change my username. But Noelle Fitchett, I'm literally the only Noelle Fitchett that exists. Fitchett with an F. So you can literally just Google it, and all my handles will come up on
I
Twitter.
misspelled your name like 20 times in that email. So I'm so sorry. And it
No,
sucks
it's
because people
fine.
always misspell mine, but I'm just letting you know.
It's a weird one. It's a weird last name, but yeah, on Instagram, Twitter, and then I'm relaunching my pod next week. So I had a guest who was transgender come on, and we had a friendly conversation. So I'm really excited for that to launch.
Awesome. I love it. Well, make sure you follow her. Podcast is on YouTube.
It's on Apple Podcast and Spotify. It's called Out of Context.
Cool. All right. Find her on Apple Podcasts, find her on Spotify. Noel, thank you so much for being here. A really fruitful conversation. I really enjoy, like I said, like you said, the talking about politics and the Lord at the same time. So, anytime you want to come back, you're always welcome. Friend of the show, and yeah, we're going to be putting this out pretty soon. So, just stick around while I stop recording.